Hi everyone, I'm Jesse. I'm VP of Strategic Partnerships here at Keen. I'm here with Steve Lounge Price, CEO of a fantastic agency called 85sixty. We're going to talk about marketing mix modeling today, and specifically, marketing mix modeling used to be the domain of enterprise CPG brands. It was a $250,000 cost of entry that returned two PowerPoint decks at two different points of the year, and Keen decision systems, as well as other software-based marketing mix modeling, has really democratized access to marketing mix modeling and allowed it to proliferate across categories. So to begin, Lounge, I'd love to just invite you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about 85sixty.
Cool. Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, so my name's Steve. Everyone calls me Lounge. Story for a different day. But I'm the founder of 85sixty. We're a roughly 100-person, I'd call us digital-centric marketing agency with offices in San Diego and in Denver. We're from day one, we've had quite a bit of focus on data and analytics. We do a lot of work in both the performance and kind of overall media buying spaces. We are fortunate to work with a lot of really cool brands in travel and outdoor, brands that tend to kind of like attach themselves to passions that people have.
It's awesome. Something that I know about 85sixty is that you really thrive or differentiate by building product, technology, and embedding your services and those tools within the organizations that you work with, within the brands that you work with, which is very different than a typical agency model. Could you talk a little bit about those capabilities and your philosophy and how you've gotten there?
Yeah, I mean, just like any agency, we kind of, some of the ways that we got places were just, kind of, a willingness to learn and do new things. But we definitely have a fair amount of experience working with technology, particularly, it started with analytics products, right? That's moved into a lot of CDP work, server side, kinds of tracking and technology. So we have clients that, we are increasingly helping them build kind of their first party data ecosystems and infrastructure, and then making sure that that gets connected to a variety of technologies, whether that's like website personalization, predictive modeling tools, things like that, so that they can do stuff with that data.
Very cool. So given that level of integration with the organizations that you work with, and as you mentioned, they tend to skew towards travel, hospitality, lifestyle type brands. How have you seen them evolve in recent years? Where have you wanted to take them, right,
Yeah.
from point A to part B, and what kind of questions are they asking you today that they might not have been asking you a few years back?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we tend to work with a lot of companies that have real relationships with their customers. The relationships aren't just purely transactional. And so those companies really understand the importance of like relevancy. They have some level of focus on, customer experience really broadly, whether that's, if you're a hospitality company, experience includes all the things that happen while you're literally like on premises,
Hmm.
as well as all of the before and after interactions, whether that's email or paid media or mobile apps. So we're seeing people definitely have, to be able to even understand who someone is. That's one of the places when it comes to anything that is identity related that we see a lot of investment today. And we're seeing that really across all of our clients. That definitely started at the enterprise, but we're seeing that now trickle its way down even into SMBs. Some of that is because the kind of entry points from a technology perspective are becoming more achievable for small businesses. And a lot of it's also just because as you've seen like cookie deprecation and things like that, you have to invest in owning some of that technology if you want to maintain like consistency in the communications that you're having with your existing customers. So we're definitely seeing, those brands have a willingness to, invest more in that. And the nice thing about that is it's generally pretty easy to, but that pays dividends, right? Like, when you have a better way of understanding who your customers are, what they want, and you have better systems that allow you to react to that in, closer to real time, generally that's a fruitful effort. And then you say, hey, that seems to be working, so let's invest more in that. So, that's where we've seen those investments happening more and more.
That makes sense. And it's also potentially a little bit novel, right? Because we are in an era right now, to your point, cookie deprecation, privacy in general is on the rise, and the consumer demand for privacy is on the rise. Um, how have those efforts in terms of building a tech stack against identity? Is there more opportunity to do that? Is there less opportunity, or is it just the
Well, I
opportunity?
mean, there's more necessity, right? That's for sure, right? Like, used to we had third party cookies that were relatively durable that formed a type of identifier that we could leverage. And a lot of times that could like sit in a platform. Again, we still had email addresses and things like that. We had some form of persistent identifier, but we didn't rely on it quite as much as we do today. So, the mandate truly is for businesses to know who their customers are, own a rich data set, connect as much of that data as you can. So if you have a bunch of different places that you interact with your customers, is there some way to understand that like, oh, this is the person on the website, this is the person on the point of sale, this is the same person on the app, and then figure out what kind of data attributes are meaningful and then compile those in a way that you can do something with them. And hopefully all of that gets relatively automated and streamlined. So, and that's where, I think a lot of people had, we have some data in our email service provider and we've got some other information here, but it wasn't super connected. So we're working with a lot of companies today to connect that data. Mm-hmm. And then you can build richer segments. If you are connecting that in the right environment, then you can also make that, kind of that data easy to what we call activate. So, as you qualify for something, that instantly goes into a platform that then has some interaction with you, whether that's showing you an ad or triggering an email or an SMS or changing, the website experience. And all of those things, I mean, some of that's very subtle to the consumer. In fact, it's probably better if it is. But it also has a high degree of relevancy. Mm-hmm. And so then your relationship, instead of being with your customer, I mean, some of those interaction points are more assistive, right? They feel less transactional to the customer and they feel more helping, right? Oh, you just did this, so you might now also want one of these or need this. Like we have clients in hospitality. And if we know that that you have done something that we know that you're likely to also probably be about to do this thing, which you might not have information about. And so even things like wayfinding. So some of the work we do on the technology side is not purely buy this, buy this, buy this, buy another, upsell, cross sell. It's also just facilitating that people have the information that they need so that they have a better experience. And then, your NPS score goes up. NPS then correlates to, recurring purchase. And so those are all the kinds of things, that we do. Again, not every client is doing that. I think everyone aspires to doing that, or should. But we definitely have some situations where we really are able, we have, highly connected consumer data. We have all the right systems in place. And as a result, we're able to really orchestrate this relationship with the consumer.
As a consumer myself and as an advertiser, I 100,000% appreciate the importance of relevancy and desire it myself. As an agency person and as a consultant to brands, sometimes identity gets me a little bit nervous also because the more fidelity you have in understanding who you served an ad to and if they came to your site and converted, the more sometimes that can drive lower funnel decisions and a motivation for asking the brand, asking the agency for serve more ads to specific people who come to my site right now and buy,
Right.
right? Have the advertisers in like the lifestyle, travel, hospitality industries that you serve, has that been a struggle? Have they traditionally been performance marketing oriented in the past 5 years? And is there a change happening there?
I mean, look, everyone is a performance marketer in one way or another, right? I would say that most of the folks that we work with, though, have a strong appreciation for brand based on the businesses that they're in, right? So they are generally in competitive industries where they have a sense of what differentiates them versus their competitors. And so they have a willingness to invest in, there's definitely a time that certain media types they expect to perform against a conversion, kind of mandate, but at the same time they're not purely focused on that. And so they understand the relationship between building brand awareness and driving scale in the lower funnel. They're not just trying to squeeze blood out of the turnip. And we know that, we realize that there are advertisers who, and this is a little bit less so, they truly are like, how do I just get, more and more and more out of, the same thing, with a little bit of a sense that, like, the instrument can be tuned to a level of precision that kind of gives forever, and not really thinking about, what the consumer is actually doing, right? Like, what is someone buying? What do they want? How big is the audience? So, we tend to want to work with brands and have the ability to work with brands that think about all of that together. Now, I think this is where media mix modeling comes in. At the same time, they don't just want to light money on fire. They always are, they want to feel that there is a return on their investments. They may have a longer term perspective of what that return is going to come from. And, a lot of the clients that we work with have seasonal components, right? And they may have very long purchase cycles. If you look at luxury travel and ski and things like that, you have to plant the seed in many cases, many months before you can reap the crop. And so, they understand that if they were purely lower funnel focused, just the time component would make it really difficult for them to grow their brands and have the success that they've seen. Now, they definitely want to understand those relationships so that they understand, like, hey, how much, should I spend 3 months ahead of time to get to this, end result when I know that I'm finally in season. And, it's where media mix modeling and a variety of, different types of activities that we undertake on the analytics side come in.
Yeah, yeah. Let's dig into that. So, I mean, in today's measurement landscape, there's multi-touch attribution, there's experimentation for incrementality, there's marketing mix modeling. How are you thinking about those options and probably others when you're talking to your brands? Is it an all or nothing equation? Are you using them in concert?
Yeah, so I'll kind of think about it this way, right? So I kind of build from the ground up. So, imagine that there's two brands and they both sell exactly the same thing at the same price. And let's say that they both are advertising on their only advertising channel is Meta. And they look in the engine and they both see the exact same CPAs and return on ad spends, and they look in their whatever analytics platform they're using and they see the same. Yet one brand is selling 10 times more than the other, right? So right there, you kind of have some form of kind of like media mix problem, right? Like something is happening that is driving the business beyond what they can explain in the kind of quantitative approaches that they have for measurement today, right? So right then you can kind of understand something else is happening. Now, let's say that that brand that's doing super well, they spend more on Meta, and then they get to the point that, in every dollar they spend, they see an incremental $3 or $4, but then they finally reach some threshold and they're like, okay, it's not going up at the same pace anymore. Now let's buy some CTV, right? And so they start putting some money into CTV and they see the things start going up again, right? So now they're doing, you're just doing this intuitive kind of media mix modeling, which you're going, okay, now CTV is driving a benefit. Now, maybe not quantifying it. At some point, then they decide they want to add programmatic display. And like, so as you start to add these things in, suddenly you kind of get from the I can feel it and I can generally understand to the point of I'm not totally sure how to think about these different contributions. I think of it as like many marketers, they start kind of like the freewheeling chef in the kitchen who's just like throwing stuff in the dish and like, oh, it tastes good, right? And then eventually they get to the point that now, okay, I've got to start measuring how much I'm doing. And so that's kind of the phases that advertisers go through. And so, we believe that each one of those tools, MTA, incrementality testing, various analytics, even just like, one-off types of modeling, they all have value. We don't believe that any of them represent the truth. I think that one of the challenges that, agency owners and a lot of marketers face, is we live in a world that has a kind of reductionist mentality that always kind of favors, the most granular form of science and mathematics, right? And believes that at the core, there is kind of like a secret formula that actually explains and predicts human behavior. And it tends to de-emphasize human experience, right? Mm-hmm. And I think as marketers, we realize that these are all different tools in the toolkit. And one of the reasons that, people come to us is because we're interpreters in many ways, right? So we kind of work with these tools. And as we're working with them, we also, one of the things that an agency does is they become aware of the shortcomings in approaches. And then we try to kind of like fill in some of those gaps. So, it's kind of long-winded, but I mean, we see all these tools working together. We believe that MMM becomes a necessity for, a kind of like navigation tool once you have a certain amount of scale and kind of like a certain type of media mix that otherwise you can't really, it essentially balances out some of the things that you can't otherwise explain.
Yeah, yeah. And for us, marketing mix modeling and measurement in general is less about what happened in the past. It's more about making decisions about what you do next. And to your point,
Right.
it's like, how does one decide what the media mix should be? Like in your example, I'm maxing out on Meta. How much of Meta should I be doing? Right. And I think even for the smaller brands, it's a critical question to like, even if you're only invested in Meta and Google, isn't it nice to know, one, are those conversions that you're seeing incremental conversions?
Right.
Two, like what's the right amount to be, are you overspent in those channels? Or if not, how much more room is there to grow? And if you are maxed out in those channels or invested past the point of diminishing returns, out of all of the options, and all the channels tend to be the right options, right? Like people used to ask me if connected TV is right for my brand. It's like, of course it's right for your brand. Audiences are watching at scale. Like,
Right.
but out of all of the options, which one do you do next, and how much of that thing do you do before you do the other? So I find it highly applicable for brands of different sizes, and playing in concert for.
Well, I mean, you can't walk away from just, media fundamentals, right? Like that's one of the things is like automation has, with automation and particularly conversion optimized automation in certain platforms, it has been easy to lose sight of this core idea that what drives response is ultimately, some level of exposure. And so, you know, one of the, thinking back to like your question of like what channel should I go into, well, it usually starts with like, well, where can I identify my audience? Where can I find like a segment that I can actually like handle? Where can I be in like a contextually relevant place? And then where can I afford to have a frequency against that audience size that actually allows me to have some level of impact and effectiveness? Because we're so, you know, people have gotten so kind of addicted to the idea that, we can infer intent in certain platforms, so we don't have to even worry anymore about the concept of who's our customer, because instead it's like, if I can identify some, behavioral signals, those actually are more relevant than anything else that I might, believe is true about my customers. And so, once you kind of get outside of, the Google, Meta, Amazon, kind of ecosystem, I think you have to go back to those principles of reach and frequency. And it is funny, a lot of brands have just lost sight of them. Larger brands that have, traditionally run, a lot of traditional media and things like that, they still are core to it. But, there's a whole world of marketers that, really came up as performance marketers and e-commerce marketers. And those are novel to them. And as they start to get outside of the bounds of, just, those performance marketing channels, that's where some of those, decisions come back in.
Right. At the end of the day, I think what we're agreeing on is that what's at play here in terms of how marketing works is fundamentally math, right?
Right.
Like these investments operate on diminishing return curves, and we can
Right.
mathematically show you that, sometimes we get the questions is like, is my marketing doing anything? And it's just like it's a mathematical truth that doing marketing
Right.
drives growth and sales for brands, right? And there is a relationship between how much you're spending and diminishing returns of the effectiveness of that spend. I think reach and
Absolutely.
frequency are metrics that help you understand, saturation within a channel and whatnot. But
Right.
still, it's like, what's the right level of reach, and am I reaching the right people? And all of that can be quantified through mathematical equations specific to your business about where you are on that diminishing return of your investment. And that's essentially what marketing mix modeling is doing.
Right.
Um, Lounge, you once said something to me I wanted just to prompt very directly about how you think about these different. You like to show clients like a low, medium, and high of like what the truth might be. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, um, there, there's often a kind of like unduplicated kind of conversion values, right? So, if I take every conversion event that every platform has taken credit for, here's what that looks like. And, we believe generally that's hyperinflated, right? So those are, that is the most generous version of the truth. There is a generally less generous. The least generous is usually something that looks like a Google Analytics post click last touch, right? And so we generally will show something like that. And then there is a modeled version that is a blend of those things that can come from a variety of different types of methods. So yeah, we want to make sure that we represent these different views into the truth, and then have discussions with our clients about what we think that indicates in terms of real performance, if I want to say that, and also like what we should do with that information for making future investments.
Mhm. Awesome. So as you've introduced, and let's be clear, actually, is marketing mix modeling new to the brands that you're working with, or relatively new, or have they been doing it for a long time?
I'd say that the brands that we are working with that are doing it, they're not new to it. What I'd say is changing is the way that they're approaching it. So historically, most of the brands that we were working with, they would do some form of exercise on maybe a annual or semi-annual basis. And again, it was interesting. That would potentially inform the types of investments, the decisions that they were making. But, it was more of like, yeah, we talk about it. We'd use that for planning. We'd come back 6 months later and, kind of run a new model. And the new model generally was not as related to the old model. I think what we're seeing with the tools today now is, right, like we can really, we can look at fit in a very short, increment. and then we can make adjustments, you know, monthly, even on shorter increments, depending on what makes sense. So that approach to it is definitely new. You know, for a lot of our clients, one of the challenges of that is that what I'd say in terms of like cross channel budget fluidity is something that they probably have not been as nimble with as this is indicating they should be, right? And so, you know, that's a little bit of a different thing both for us and for them. You know, we believe that's a really exciting opportunity, and I think they are starting to get used to that as well. But that's probably one of the biggest differences as we're working with Keen is, you know, that we kind of have it there all the time. And, you know, it also makes, you know, when we were building media mix models previously, it was just a lot harder to tune them, right? And so it's much easier for us to run multiple models and to think about different factors in different in different ways. So that, you know, you can look at different outcomes. So, you know, again, there's a lot of, you know, media mix model is kind of like a hypothesis, right? And we would have, you know, kind of one theory every 6 months. And now we can actually like tune that quite a bit differently.
Yeah, and reconcile forecasts versus actualize and update the model and now make decisions because, like, especially I would say in your category, the world changes all the time. The
Yeah.
weather changes. All kinds of things influence, you know, literally like you work with ski resorts, like the snow changes, right? Like so much
Yeah.
change. Um, and so, you know, I think the goal historically of measurement was to get it right. You know, like what
Right.
is the answer? And then like that answer is supposed to stay true when the fact of the matter is that the world changes. And so what was right yesterday might not be right tomorrow. And so
Yeah,
that's one of the
absolutely.
benefits of having an updatable, reconcilable model that learns about your business and its environment as it changes. So if marketing mix modeling originally, and it's great to hear that the brands you work with have been doing it in some form or fashion, but it was probably originally developed to model CPG brands at grocery where it's like someone's buying a box of cereal every week. Are there challenges in and maybe not, but like, what's your experience been in terms of bringing those kinds of environmental factors into a
Mhm.
marketing mix model for a category, a product category that doesn't have a repeat purchase frequency like a box of cereal? What kind of stuff
Right.
are you modeling, and how's it going?
Yeah. So, I mean, we do work with hospitality brands, and, you know, we do a fair amount of work in the ski industry as well. And so, you know, what I'd say is like snowfall is not too hard, right? Because it's easily quantifiable, right? So it snowed a foot, it didn't snow a foot, right?
Mhm.
And so, you know, the nice thing about that is those patterns in the data are pretty easily discernible, right?
Mhm.
Snows more, people ski more, right? Pretty easy to like find those relationships. I think where things get more challenging is long purchase cycles. I think seasonality, you know, like I would use, you know, I think one of the things that we've seen is that, you know, when you have a seasonal business, the way that you make media investments is tied to the seasonality. And so you may in hospitality, like let's say that your peak season, right, is in the spring. And so your media mix in the spring looks significantly different than it does the rest of the year. And then when you put all that, and so just naturally, like if you did nothing, there would still be this big spike in transaction activity when you get to the spring, but you try to, you know, accelerate that by putting more media types, more overall volume into the market to take advantage of just consumer behaviors. As a result, because, you know, you may have channels like linear television that turn on and off next to that seasonality, you know, the model wants to infer causality to that. And so how we kind of pull those things apart, those are, I think, some of the challenges that the advertisers that we work with have. That's where, we look at incrementality testing, and particularly geo holdout incrementality testing, as a way to do more validation. However, when you have a really seasonal business, you may not really want to do any form of holdout because so much of your transaction volume gets compressed. And so, do I really want to hold out a significant DMA for like a 30 or 60-day holdout period? Maybe, maybe not. But we haven't necessarily seen, I think that's been one of the things that we, struggle with a little bit sometimes, is that some of the things that we want to do from validation, from a science perspective, they may represent some level of commercial risk for the advertiser, and so they don't want to do that. But we are finding some different ways to try to get at that today that is not disruptive but can provide validation, which then we can feed back into the model.
Yeah, and I think that's great, and like the ability to bring in that full knowledge estate into a software-based application like Keen. That's not like we're not what we care about is enabling you and your brands to make decisions based off of what you know about their world. And so while we
Right.
do provide measurement and we have a lot of faith in our measurement, we also think that it's really critical that you make decisions based off of the information that you believe and trust and have come to learn that's true. And so the ability to bring in the results of those kinds of experiments into our platform to use for planning and forecasting purposes, which is then reconcilable, is we're leaning into that ecosystem across measurement types.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's, I mean, one of the things we've worked with your team a lot, which is, you mentioned like CPG, right? Like, if I'm selling spaghetti sauce, right, like I'm kind of always on the aisle. And, so the changes in the media mix and how that then impacts, sales on the shelves, like that can be potentially more straightforward. But I think we definitely have, in the process, run through a lot of different, long purchase cycle is a great example. Like, in luxury travel, we know that there are a ton of touch points, and in many cases, it's kind of a 45 day from first starting to think and investigate it to I actually purchased. And so, thinking about all of these things together, we have, also clients that may have a very significant amount of promotional activity against a very small window of time. And so that's going to drive a ton of conversion volume, even though, it was all of the media that ran up to that played a really important part. But how do we make sure that, we're thinking about the contributions of those things that were, 30, 60, 90 days? And is there a different signal then versus transaction that we need to start to think about to understand the contribution of media to the final event? And, those are important questions, and like trying to figure out how we can quantify that is something that we've worked with your teams with quite a bit. And I would say that as we have done that, the results out of the models have changed significantly, to a point that now we feel much more confident that what's in the model actually represents, what's happening. It's not overweighting, factors that again are fully understandable, and that traditional methods we would have run in the past would have made it much more difficult to kind of cancel some of that noise out and get to a higher degree of believability.
awesome. So with that higher degree of believability in place, are your non CPG brands? Because again, we wanted to talk about the fact that more categories, different kinds of brands, the brands that you work with tend to be non CPG. Because of that greater degree of predictability and the factors like snowfall and seasonality and those other things that you're bringing into the models, are they leaned in? How has it influenced their internal decision making processes and like your ability to get approval on your recommendations? Are they actioning based off of the findings, or are they still?
Absolutely. I mean, and again, like we have a highly, we're I think trusted advisors in that. And so what in terms of like budgeting decisions, absolutely, right? Like, and I would imagine like most people, there are recommendations that I think some of the recommendations that the models make, sometimes we just say, or the advertiser says, we understand why the model is saying that, because let's imagine like in travel, you're in a competitive environment and the model is saying you might be over invested in search. And again, search is not necessarily, causing incremental conversions, but you might be in a highly competitive environment where the OTAs are on your keywords. And so you have to bid on those. So again, you just can set a floor there and say, hey, we have to be here. And so we definitely have some of that going on. But yeah, otherwise, like we're definitely making budget adjustments for clients based on what we see in those. And, if anything, I'd say frequently the models allow us to trust our intuition in places that historically are more of the blind spots, right? So if you think of, we're talking about CTV and really all forms of kind of digital video, whether it's linear television, it tends to be the non-clickable formats, right? Which for performance advertisers tend to get underemphasized. Those tend to be favored often in the models, particularly, we work with very brand focused advertisers. Mm-hmm. And so when they are getting pulled into performance metrics, they tend to, and again, those channels tend to perform quite well. Meta and Google and places like that perform very, very well for those advertisers, and they generally have a fair amount of scale. I think what the models help us to understand is like, if they continue to make additional investments in, these kind of brand building channels and efforts, how much additional scale is actually available? And that's very eye-opening. So, but yeah, so we definitely are using it. We're making decisions. We're making budget adjustments off it. Those are things that are happening today.
Love it. This is going to be a very difficult conversation to recap here in like 3 sentences. I wish I was taking more notes and planned on what I was going to say to recap it. But what I think that's ultimately what I heard is that while marketing mix modeling in and of itself might not be new to this category, what's new is having the nimble, more real-time access of a living model that adjusts into the future to make decisions off of. That the model's fidelity is increased because you're able to bring in quantifiable environmental factors that change, and have the model update as they change, and that organizations are leaned in to making decisions based off of what the model tells them, but also by applying the intelligence of what they know about their market, their brand, and their strategy, so that they're not just taking recommendations on face value, but inputting constraints based off of their strategic necessity. Also, definitely heard that marketing mix modeling isn't a be all and end all for these brands, that there are different measurement methodologies that show kind of like most conservative estimate of what the truth is, the most generous estimate of what the universe is, and a modeled coming together of what likely the answer might be. But that even those findings should continue to be evaluated and experimented with and actualized, so that you can sharpen your strategies over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's kind of different tools for different jobs too. And so, particularly for budget allocation, higher level planning, things, of that nature, we're turning to, MMM. I'm not using it on a daily basis to like optimize within a channel, right? So, our buyers, for example, are working in platform and they're working in other tools that either we've developed ourselves or, are using, that are helping us make what we believe are better decisions about the allocations within the platforms. I think there's an interesting, I don't know if it's the missing link, but one of the challenges for me, the advertisers that we work for, is that we have to make some trade-offs to create kind of meaningful buckets of data for modeling. And so, the level of granularity that exists within individual campaigns is often too minute to be able to be useful for models.
Right.
And so, if you're a really big advertiser, you may not have that. You might also be working with more compressed channels. The other thing that's been really interesting is that, just look at Google's ecosystem, the products that that they build are changing so much as well that when we look at historicals, what was, the YouTube of 2 years ago or even 6 months ago is different than the YouTube of today. And so again, like you said, there's looking back and looking forward. And somebody told me a long time ago there's a reason that the windshield is bigger than the rear view mirror.
Mm-hmm.
But so we tend to try to very much look forward. But some of that, those are some of the complexities, right, that we're dealing with. And again, that's where us as kind of a navigator, working with both our partners like you as well as our clients to figure out how do we package this information, which ultimately is required to model in a way that is useful, right, and really represents the underlying thing, but is also big enough that we can find the patterns that we're trying to.
You've touched on two things that I genuinely, what brought me to Keen, what I love about Keen. One is because of those changes in YouTube and Meta and every other channel, that's the power of our marketing elasticity engine. If you
Yeah.
were just to use the brand's own data in a model, the model would be very slow to detect those changes. But because we're
Right.
sitting on top of $8 billion of spend and and our training data updates with every model, we're bringing that industry and category level intelligence of those changes and applying it to your model in real time. That's
But
one.
I mean, even like if you think of like Performance Max, Demand Gen, YouTube,
Yeah.
Discovery, right? Like,
Yep.
so you had all these products, and they
Yep.
used to be separate products,
Nice.
and now they're kind of blurred together. And then even like these kind of combinations of inventory assets, now those have changed. And so there is just like this core semantic issue as well when we do categorization,
Mm-hmm.
which is, what used to be YouTube and bought as YouTube and labeled as YouTube is now embedded inside demand gen.
Right.
And so when we run a model and it says, hey, you should invest more in YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
we're kind of like, hold on, is that YouTube or is that demand gen
Right.
YouTube? Which again is also has a whole set of different kind of mechanical constraints.
Right.
So when you just even think of it from a supply side,
Yep.
the inventory that undermines the label that we're putting
Mm-hmm.
on it is changing
Yep.
over time. And so, it makes it more complicated. I mean, we've talked about this a lot, particularly where we have some clients that make like big buys in Performance Max, or some of these things that are, amalgamations of different inventory assets.
It's working.
How do we think about what the model's really saying, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not really buying Performance Max. That's not what you're getting, right? You're either getting search or YouTube or,
Right.
you're getting a different type of inventory.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you can break out a lot of those things in the system. I understand that it's PMAXs and these channels are
Mm-hmm.
aggregated at this point. Um, I'll save your time and save myself from waxing poetic on that, but I'll talk to Brian about it because I think
Yeah.
that we have some solutions. But the other thing that I think is really great about the system is I don't know if you know, but you can link three plans together in our system. So we have
Mm-hmm.
say planning 25, 26, and 27. 3 years worth of planning. The beauty of that for your industries is like you could model based off of variable environmental inputs. So you could say, what if it's a heavy snowfall year versus
Mm-hmm.
what if it's a light snowfall year? Of course, if it's a light snowfall year, revenue is going to be down no matter what you do. The question is how much do you pull back so that you don't shoot yourself in the foot in a light year and shoot
Right.
yourself in the foot going into the year after that, right? Have you
Well,
made
it's funny because we actually almost see it. I think one of the things that we are learning is it's almost the opposite, right? Because if you think of snowfall is like a media channel. It's like media, right? Because when it snows a lot, everybody talks about it. It's on television. So you almost can use like a big snow year as a form of advertising. So when it snows a lot, you almost don't have to advertise as much.
Right.
Whereas when it doesn't snow, you actually have to create demand more. And so the role of advertising becomes, and I think that's honestly true in almost any business, right? When demand is high, your desire is to like, spend into that. But the reality is there is reason to think that you need to, you're better represented to spend into weakness. And,
Right.
I've always heard of, bigger brands look at times of weakness as times of opportunity, right? Because you also generally, your competitors aren't spending as much. And so, I think that's some of what we're seeing a little bit. Again, you spending into strength drives a good result, but it might not have the same level of necessity as spending into weakness. So
From a same year perspective, absolutely. And I think and the yes and to it is like, how do we leverage this moment in this environment to
yeah,
drive strength for
right,
next year and the year after from a multi-year contribution perspective? You're right. When
yep,
the environment is primed, it's like, yeah, pull back and take some of that profitability and allow your base to grow. And like,
right.
what does that mean? What are the implications for how we invest coming out of the season to build that momentum, to build on that momentum, right?
Right.
So awesome questions that technology is unlocking. And thank you again for doing this, Lounge. And this has been great. Austin's gonna have his work cut out for him because there's so much good stuff. Anything else you want to get in here, or before we?
No, I mean that's it's been great to work with you guys. I think you know just like you know the clients and the advertisers that we work with look to us, to help them with these questions around measurement. You know, we I think sometimes they think, cool, we ask you and you have all the answers, right? And we're using a variety of tools, and like those tools also aren't just, everything is customized to some degree. And so having partners like yourselves that not only have core technology, but then also have, kind of the interest in, hey, how do we make these tools work better? And how do we make them, how do we tune them to answer specific questions and, be, that the world is not only of kind of like one shape and size. Like that's been, great for us to have a partner that's like that engaged in it as well.
Yep, appreciate it. Appreciate you. Thank you. Let's wrap it.